Sounds good. So I'm going to go ahead and can everyone see my screen, or is it just me?
Yes.
Okay, very good.
You're good.
All right. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm David Shay.
And I'm Katie Hoskins.
We're from the Irvin Department of Rare Books and Special Collections at the University of South Carolina. And we're going to talk to you guys a little bit today about cataloging monographs in RDA and MARC 21. So we're just going to start out. Katie's going to talk about like some of the core, concepts in RDA, and then we'll go down kind of a line by line MARC 21 list and talk about how to code fields in accordance with MARC 21 stuff. If anyone has any questions, just pop a message in the chat and we will do our best to help you. So that being said, so here's kind of our outline for today. Just a little bit about me. I have been cataloging for almost 11 years now in a lot of different kind of roles and positions, public libraries, government libraries, academic libraries. So I had a little bit of hand in all sorts of things. But since 2015, I've been head of cataloging for the Irvin Department of Rare Books and Special Collections. So Katie, if you want to introduce yourself.
I have been at the Irvin Department of Rare Books and Special Collections for almost exactly 2 years now. I've been working with David ever since I was almost done with my MLIS. I finished that in 2019. I was an intern that summer, cataloging the collection of comic books that USC received. And since then, I've gotten to work with so many different types of materials. And I actually attended this session 2 years ago in person, and now I have the pleasure of co-presenting it. So that's what I'll say about me.
Welcome. So, Katie,
if you want to switch over, I can share my screen, and so I can flip through them if that's easier.
Good. Yeah.
Okay.
Let me figure. Sorry, Zoom's still a little. Darn it. All right, you're up.
Okay. So that big. Okay, can you see the slides now from my computer screen?
Yes.
Okay, go here. I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off, but of course, if you cannot hear me or anything, please just interrupt me, let me know, and type your questions in the chat box. I think David is going to monitor that while I'm speaking. Okay, so let me go ahead and do that. Okay, so now you can't see me, but you can see my slides. All right, and as you likely know, it's been about 10 years since RDA was initially released, and right now it's undergoing a lot of pretty major changes. The 3R project was just completed. So I'm actually going to start us off by taking a step back and just going over some of the basics about RDA, like David said, how we got here and what RDA was even designed to cover. And then we'll get into the practical part of the presentation. Okay, so whether we're talking about metadata or cataloging, effective resource description is always based on standards. And in some cases, we have a whole slew of them. In the case of library materials, RDA, which is resource description and access, answers some of those key questions, and I have some listed right here on the slide. So for example, what elements should we or can we include in a record? To fully describe a resource, what information do we need to document in the bibliographic record? So the catalog's surrogate for that resource. Some things we might consider are title, author, edition, place of publication, dimensions, maybe even the color of the cover for some patrons maybe. But both RDA and its predecessor, AACR2, which is Anglo-American Cataloging Rules, provide us with an element set. So another question is, how should we input the data into those elements? How are we going to ensure the consistency of the content of those elements across our catalog or a greater shared environment, cataloging environment? We can think about things like capitalization, abbreviations, how to handle misspellings in in a book's title, for instance, or punctuation within that title. Those are other things that RDA and AACR2 answer for us. The last question I have here on the slide is, what values should we input for controlled fields? This is fields where a controlled vocabulary dictates the data values that we can use, and actually which fields even need to be controlled at all or should be controlled. So RDA does provide us with lists of preferred terms for some elements, but for others, we do need to turn to other sources like the Library of Congress subject headings, which I know we're all familiar with, LC-NACO name authority file, and other specialized vocabularies. One is the Art and Architecture thesaurus. Okay, so AACR2 and RDA themselves are actually based on certain principles, standards, models as well. And you'll notice that these are coming out of the international library community. The Paris principles and the suite of ISBDs, namely this one I have here, ISBD M, which is International Standard Bibliographic Description for Monographic Publications. Those are the basis for AACR2. But a lot has happened since 1978, since the release of that standard. Namely, library catalogs have gone online, of course, but we have some other things that have happened that necessitated kind of a reworking of those standards of our cataloging codes. One of them has been the growth of the variety of types of materials that we're cataloging. Another is just trying to meet the rapidly growing publishing output. So FRBR and the Statement of International Cataloging Principles were born out of all of these changes. And then in 2009/2010, RDA was born. So let's back up and talk about FRBR for just a little bit. FRBR is IFLA's functional requirements for bibliographic records. So I have an excerpt here straight from FRBR, and I'm going to read it quickly, and then we will just break it down and try to make sense of what it says. So the terms of reference for the study called for the development of a framework that identifies and clearly defines the entities of interest to users of bibliographic records, the attributes of each entity, and the types of relationships that operate between entities. So the intent was to produce a conceptual model that would serve as the basis for relating specific attributes and relationships. And this part is important, are reflected in the record as discrete data elements to the various tasks that users perform when consulting bibliographic records. I know that's a bit of a long excerpt, but it really explains what FRBR was designed to do. Now it sets forth an entity relationship model, which was kind of outdated by the time of FRBR's release, but it works really well. The authors chose it to try and conceptualize our increasingly complex bibliographic universe. So in the ER model, we have entities, relationships, attributes. I think these are pretty self-explanatory, but I'll just say a word about each one real quick. So an entity is something that is distinct and exists within our database, for example, and can be described like a work, person, place. And then these entities have relationships. So a work is created by a person, a work has a subject. These are examples of the relationships between entities. Then entities are identified by their attributes. So date of birth is an attribute of a person. Also, you might think of attribute and relationship as other words for elements as we know them. Okay, I'm getting some pop-ups of people waiting in the waiting room. Tiffany, are you controlling the admission right now?
Yeah, I have that.
Okay, great.
You don't have to worry about that.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so moving on, we'll go into the user tasks. So like we said in this excerpt here, the various tasks that users perform when consulting bibliographic records, those are known as FRBR's user tasks as they define them. They should sound really familiar because they're so similar to Cutter's objectives. So catalog users need to find, identify, select, and acquire library resources. So now the final piece of this puzzle here is the resulting basic level bibliographic record. So what the authors of FRBR did is they mapped the relationships and attributes to those user tasks to tell us specifically what data elements are most important in a bib record for the user to be able to carry out those tasks. Okay, so unfortunately, the methodology behind FRBR, behind this study, wasn't super well explained. And so there has been some criticism of FRBR. Karen Coyle said, everything about the document revolves around the ER analysis, the entities, entity attributes, and the bibliographic relationships, which isn't a bad thing, but it is to say that FRBR did not really actually accomplish what FRBR set out to do, which was, as the title suggests, create functional requirements for bibliographic records. So really, the star of FRBR is the model. Okay, anyhow, the model established in FRBR and now in LRM, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, was the basis for RDA and its organization. And RDA uses the same terminology that we just discussed in the previous slides. So some things to keep in mind. We know FRBR is the basis for RDA, and FRBR was designed to transcend local differences. And that means that it does not care what language you catalog in, what encoding scheme you use. So it was definitely not designed specifically for users of MARC format. And MARC format, which we use, was certainly not designed with FRBR or RDA in mind. So elements in MARC and RDA are not always equivalent, and some may be treated in one, but not the other. Okay, so RDA is compatible with MARC, but the organization of elements is very different, is what we need to keep in mind and what you'll find. So elements we're familiar with in MARC bibliographic are spread out in RDA, primarily across 4 FRBR entities. And those entities are what makes up the WEMI model, which is notoriously hard to grasp. Those 4 entities are work, expression, manifestation, and item. So WEMI separates a single resource into those 4 entities. And then I'll go through a little bit more about the WEMI model, but before we jump into that, I think it's important to keep in mind that a resource you can actually hold in your hand contains all 4 of these entities. So one cannot physically exist without all of the others. Okay, so the 4 WEMI entities make up the first of 3 groups of entities in FRBR. And these are defined as the products of intellectual or artistic endeavor. And the order of these entities is important: WEMI, work, expression, manifestation, item, because they move from most abstract to least abstract, from abstract to concrete. So starting with a work, work is a distinct intellectual or artistic creation. To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee is a distinct intellectual or artistic creation. But when we talk about To Kill a Mockingbird, the work, okay, we're talking about its content only. So as a work, you can think of it as the story or the idea behind the text. Or you can also think of it as the sum of all of its expressions and manifestations. And I think that sort of difference in definitions, which are both valid in FRBR, is maybe one reason why this model is difficult to grasp. Okay, so expression adds another element or aspect, and that would be the form. So one expression of the work To Kill a Mockingbird is in English text. Another may be in Spanish spoken word. Okay, then manifestation, we add another level, and that's the carrier. So it's the physical embodiment of an expression. This example here, J.B. Lippincott Company's 1960 print book publication of To Kill a Mockingbird is one manifestation of the original English text expression of the work. Okay, so there is a little bit more confusion that can be added to this, because it's not just, this super simple model like maybe it looks like here. There are some other layers, and it's attempting to describe this super complex bibliographic universe. And we know that, one work does not only exist as one expression, one manifestation, one item. So basically, just like we can have multiple expressions of the same work, we can have multiple manifestations of the same expression. And then even trickier, we can also have a single manifestation that contains multiple expressions of the same work. So that might be a side-by-side English and Spanish translation, okay? And of course, a manifestation can contain multiple works. Okay, so item we'll talk about finally is probably the easiest of the entities to understand. It is the single exemplar of a manifestation. It's the physical copy you hold in your hand. All right, here it is presented just a little bit differently with some more examples. And this is the official wording. A work is realized through an expression, is embodied in a manifestation, which in turn is exemplified by an item. Okay, so I won't spend too much more time on this because we do have a lot to get through today. But when we create a bibliographic record, we're mainly recording attributes of the manifestation part of that resource. So we take the item in hand to be representative of all the items that make up a particular manifestation. And then we record mostly attributes of the manifestation. But we do include some attributes and relationships that relate to work and expression, and maybe sometimes even item. So in MARC, attributes of works and expressions mainly live in authority records. So records for, maybe a person, or for a specific work that could be expressed in many, many different ways. Okay. Let's see. But when we are creating a MARC bib record, like I said, it's going to be mostly attributes of the manifestation. But we also probably want to record some things that apply to the work and expression attributes, like that it's in English. For example, in MARC, we put this in the fixed field language, in one place. It may also appear in other places, like the 041 field, in a language note, even in the access points. But in RDA, it's recorded in language of expression, which is an element of an expression. So you'll have to find the instructions on that in RDA's section on identifying works and expressions, not manifestations. All right, let's move on. So you can see this organization is really what I'm trying to point out. And here's a screenshot of the table of contents from RDA. You have the lovely pink background. So sections 1 through 4 of RDA are the guidelines for recording attributes of the entities. Preferred title for work and language of expression are both found under recording attributes of work and expression. And we might include both of those in a bibliographic record. So title proper, which applies to the manifestation, and a note specific to an individual item are found under recording attributes of manifestation and item. Guidelines for recording relationships between entities are found in sections 5 through 10. Some of these might be the relationship between a work and its author, or an expression and its performer. So basically, all of this is to say that following the RDA guidelines when recording elements for a MARC bib record requires a good deal of approximation and translation. And we do still have access in the original RDA toolkit to the RDA MARC 21 mappings. And those are super helpful for wrapping your head around all of this. Okay, here's just an example of the guidelines that you'll find for each element. So designation of addition is a sub-element of addition statement, which is an attribute element of a manifestation. So these are some excerpts from RDA that show the types of information that you'll find for mostly for each element. So for example, we have this scope here. It gives us certain words to look for when trying to determine whether this piece of data we have can even be considered under RDA as a designation of addition. So you also have guidance of the location in the resource from which you should take this statement. How to record it is very important. This section always has lots of examples, which is really great. And then other conditions such as what to do if a designation of addition is in more than one language on your resource. If you have statements indicating regular revision or numbering. Also, if designation of addition is integral to the title proper, what do you do according to RDA? So just know that there are special requirements for each of these different conditions. And so just know that those exist, and this is the type of information that you'll find within RDA. All right, I've included this slide to remind us that RDA is not just a one-stop shop, basically, for cataloging. There are other policies and guidance that we need to follow beyond RDA to create a complete MARC bib record. As an OCLC member, for example, USC has to comply with OCLC's guidelines and standards. At USC, we also follow the LC-PCC policy statements for RDA. For cataloging in MARC format, of course, you need to consult MARC 21 format for bibliographic data. And oftentimes, because collections and users are unique, you may also have local policies and standards or specialized guides that you use, like DCRM for rare materials. Okay, so I've listed here again the 3 questions that we talked about at the beginning, and just the sources that you will likely consult to answer each of them. And I want to quickly talk about the very first line there, and that's what elements should or can we include in a record. So RDA doesn't do the same breakdown of various levels of cataloging that AACR2 did. It designates certain elements as core and others as enhanced, and that's what you get. And then after the 3R project, even that goes away. So we have to rely a lot more on catalogers' judgment or on local application profiles, standards, and the LC-PCC policy statements if you make use of those. All right, so back to our example of designation of addition. We're going to take this one example and fill in the MARC 250 field according to RDA. Now, when David starts his part of the presentation, he's going to take you line through line of a MARC bib record. And this is kind of an example of what goes on behind the scenes how he came up with the info that's included on the slides to give you those most common cases that you'll come across. Okay, it's all coming from existing standards. It's not made up. Okay, so let's say we have this statement, second revised edition on a title page verso of our resource. And revised, you can see in this, hypothetical example, is abbreviated. Okay, so we know we need to include this information in our record because designation of edition is a core element in RDA, and furthermore, it's required if applicable in OCLC BIB formats, which is where OCLC member libraries usually will look to find the guidelines for submitting records as part of OCLC. It's really kind of like OCLC's version of MARC 21 bibliographic for OCLC members, but anyone can use it. It's a very helpful site if you're not familiar with it. I think David's linked it in one of his first slides. Okay, so the statement does fit RDA's scope for designation of edition, so we can include it as that element. And even though it's presumably not from the same source as the title proper, which we're going to assume is on the title page, this is on the title page verso, it's still within the manifestation itself, so we do not need to record it in brackets, which in RDA we would only do for information that comes from outside the resource altogether. Okay, and then lastly, on this how question, in the broader guidelines for edition statement sub-elements, we see that information is to be transcribed. So we copy it into our 250 field exactly as it appears on the title page verso. Okay, but we do have to follow RDA's guidelines for transcription, which is a little bit modified from just straight transcribing. Okay, so we don't abbreviate edition, but we also don't spell out revise. We just leave it as it is. So encoding it in MARC format for the 250 field, this whole statement will go in a subfield A. Both our indicators are undefined, so we leave them blank. And ISBD punctuation prescribes an optional terminal period at the end of this field. Traditionally, our library has included optional periods, but David will speak a little bit about punctuation and the direction that's going. Okay, so switching gears here, we're going to talk quickly about recent changes to RDA. So FRBR over the year has gained some additional family members, the functional requirements for authority and subject authority data. These came onto the scene around the same time when RDA was released, and they added to the bibliographic model in FRBR. But because of some conceptual differences, when these were combined into one model, there was also some editing revision that took place. But the result was IFLA LRM, which is the library reference model. So when IFLA was revised and consolidated into LRM, the RDA steering committee worked on bringing RDA into compliance with that model. They also took this opportunity to rework the whole toolkit. And this project was called the RDA Toolkit Restructure and Redesign Project, or the 3R project. All right, so the restructure was a bit dramatic, to say the least. We went from having a table of contents on the left. It felt like you were navigating around in an ebook sort of environment. Now, we have this these 4 drop-down tabs for navigating, and it's very, very obvious that this comes from the library reference model, which was based on FRBR. So it takes some getting used to. Now, in the notes for this slide, which you'll have access to because you attended this session, the notes, in PowerPoint for this slide, I mean. So I've included the link to the RDA Steering Committee FAQs about the beta toolkit. And these, I think, really illustrate how much of a change this 3R project created. So why are there so many elements? Why are the element labels so granular and so difficult to understand? Why are there so many options, and what happened to the relationship designators? Okay, so the content has also been updated, and that is an effect of the revisions that happened to all of the FRBR and its family members transitioning to LRM, and also bringing RDA up to date with just the international community. So we get some new entities and elements. Relationship designators are now called relationship elements. The inverse of each element is also its own element now. So there are more than 100 elements. There are a ton of them. Okay, so thankfully the new guidelines for creating RDA compliant MARC bib records are largely unchanged. The major changes that we see to the content in RDA really make it a better guide for more flexible cataloging that takes place outside of the MARC-based catalog. So the main change for us is that we need to rely more on the PCC policy statements and also local policy decisions because the amount of catalogers' judgment required has basically tripled. So the effect on RDA cataloging in MARC is minimal, but because it's sure to throw you off when you first start to try to navigate around in a new toolkit. And the countdown clock on the original toolkit will begin at some point. I don't think it's something that you can ignore, and I've included links here on the slide to videos posted by the official RDA Toolkit channel on YouTube that are really helpful. One of them is the toolkit demo, which just happened a little while ago now in January. And then also they have a video series, RDA Concepts, and you'll also find videos there about RDA in general, not focused on the new toolkit. But with that, I will actually stop sharing my screen, or well, if we have time for some questions before I hand it over to David. That concludes my section here.
Pop anything in? I'll go ahead and
here, I'll stop sharing my screen.
Okay.
You can switch.
All right. Crud. Sorry about that. So let's, before we get into some of actually applying all this stuff, I've got a list of some useful resources here. Library of Congress MARC 21 bibliographic description provides breakdowns of every field. So does OCLC bib formats and standards. It's just a question of which is best applied to what you're working on, as well as some other useful things that you can take a look at. A quick note about punctuation. I am in this cataloging attempting to conform to ISBD punctuation standards. All of these standards are technically relics of physical card catalogs, like how all of this punctuation was set in to help break up information on, the little index cards. There are a lot of various kinds of ongoing conversations about eliminating or reducing punctuation. Ultimately, that is a decision for you guys to make kind of on your own, and just how things display in your online catalog. So I'm going to start out straight at the top with fixed fields. This is how all the fixed fields look in OCLC. So I'm kind of describing it from this perspective, but this is everything that ends up in a leader field in your catalog or in a 008 field. It is possible to go into the 008 field and enter all of this, bit by bit in numbers 0 through 39, but just keep in mind, if you try to do that, which I don't recommend, it starts counting from 0, not from 1, which kind of throws you off. So starting off, type. This is type of records. For pretty much all monograph book items, A is your answer here. We at Rare Books sometimes use T for manuscript materials. So handwritten letters, someone's physical diaries or journals, anytime where you have something that's handwritten or was only produced once. Encoding level, OCLC and Library of Congress have breakdowns on what the encoding level includes. I've encoded it here blank for a full level record. Cataloging source here is almost always going to be, you're almost going to always have it D. Blank, for example, is a national bibliographic entity. So the Library of Congress and its equivalent in other countries. AUDN stands for audience, and there are a number of different audience options you can break down. So things like, is it a variant of a juvenile audience? And there's several different options for that. General audiences, adult audiences, etc. Control, this is your type of control. This is always almost going to be blank. I believe that the other option for that is archival. So if you're dealing with archival materials, just let me double check that real quick. Yeah, archival is the other option. And then your 3-letter language code, which is the language for the material, not the language that's been cataloged in. I'll point out where that changes in a little bit. Fixed fields line 2, BLVL, bibliographic level. In this case, it's M for monographs. We also use, at Rare Books, we use C for collection a lot. So when we're defining people's papers, or if you have a collection of different things. Just recently, I had a collection of a series of booklets for a nurse training camp at Vassar College during the First World War. And along with that, I had a notebook from the woman who had owned these books and several letters that she had received. So I chose to catalog it as a collection to maintain the integrity of that unit. Form is blank for most books, D for large print books. Conference publication, 0 for no, 1 for yes. It's a binary option. Is this is the publication you have in hand the production of some kind of conference? So like a convention program or the proceedings of the 10th International Conference on Electronics or something like that. Biography, B for individual biography, blank for not a biography. There are also choices for autobiography and collective biography. Modified record, this is just an obsolete field, just enter blank. And then your country of publication. So this is a 2 or 3-letter code for where this came from. Most other countries are only going to be 2 letters. United States, Canada, Great Britain, Australia, China, and China are the only countries that I believe have full 3-letter codes that breaks things down into province level. So in this case, we have NY for New York and then U for United States. If you had something from Scotland, it would be STK for Scotland, United Kingdom. Contents. What kind of contents does the book have? So we've got 4 options. Some examples, we have B for bibliographies, number 6 for comics and graphic novels, which is by far the one we use the most. And that I would imagine that a lot of public institutions are not going to have a lot of things that need a nature of contents marker. Government publications, in this case we have blank for it is not a government publication. There's also S for state, F for federal, I for international, depending on what kind of level a document comes out of. Literary form, in this case we have 1 for fiction, not further described, 0 would be for nonfiction, not described further. Index, in this case we have 0 for no index. If we had an index, it would be 1, so this is another binary choice, 0 for no, 1 for yes. And depending on your index, if you have an index, you're going to need a 500 or a 504 note, which I'll go into later on in the presentation. Other books fields, line 4. DESC, descriptive cataloging form. So if you're doing you want to do I for RDA. Although if you're doing RDA but you're omitting punctuation, like I mentioned earlier that you could, you want to use C. Illustrations, we have 4 indicators for different kinds of illustrations. In this case, I have A for illustrations and B for maps. These are kind of the most common things. You also have things like genealogical tables. There's actually an O for photographs. Now, this is not for photographs that are printed in books. That is specifically for photographs that are physically mounted in the book. Otherwise, photographs just fall under A for illustration. Fesh script. This is another binary choice, 0 for no, 1 for yes. And what the heck is a Fesh script? A Fesh script is a book that is a collection of essays dedicated to a person in a field that person is an expert in. So if I was an expert in frog biology and a group of people who were in the same field as me wanted to dedicate a book to me, on frog biology, they would each write their essays or their articles about frog biology, compile it in this book, and dedicate it to me. And that's the short and dirty of what a Fesh script is. DTST, type of date. Single is going to, S for single is your most common. In this case, we have R for reprint, but there's also T for when you have different publication and copyright dates. So your first date is your most current version. The second publication date is if you have a previous version. So in this case, we have a reprint that was reprinted in 2016 from an original that was published in 1974. Sorry to go through these very quickly. None of these really necessarily conform to say RDA. This is all just MARC 21 necessities, and none of these fixed fields are really getting seen by your patron. They're all going into the machine readable background data in your leader field in your record or your 008 field. Any questions before going on? And Katie will let me know if there are. She's monitoring the chat.
All right, no questions yet.
Okay, great. Our 007, our introduction. This is physical characteristics of the book. This is also the physical characteristics for any kind of material that you might have. So there's greater detail for things like audio-visual materials, physical objects, visual materials that are going to describe in greater detail what this thing is. In this case, in our subfield A, we have T for text, and B and A for regular print, or B for we can have B for large print. There are many more fields for other kinds of materials. Your O2O, your ISBN, so this is your control, what kind of, international standard book number. check your verso and your back cover, and then you can additionally add a subfield Q to provide additional information like paperback. So we catalog multi-volume graphic novels or comic omnibuses. We tend to do them on one singular bibliographic record for the whole series. Other people will do them individually based on the needs and based on their specific needs and the conditions of how their ILS works. And you can use, but if you are compiling multiple volumes with individual ISBN numbers in a single bibliographic record, you can use this subfield Q to indicate which ISBNs go with which volumes. 040 is your cataloging source. For this, OCLC uses subfield A for whomever created the record. I suspect the other bibliographic things do the same. The important parts for us are this subfield B and this subfield E. Subfield B is the language of the catalog record. Do not use a record that has something else in the subfield B besides ENG. That in that case, you're looking at a catalog record that was created in a different language. So you're going to run across a few odd things like abbreviate. So in like German and a lot of Nordic records in Nordic languages, in the physical description, you will see pages marked with an S period instead of a P period, for one example. 041 language code. This is for when you have translations or material or books that contain other languages. In this case, this book is a translation from Norwegian to English. So our first indicator is going to mark is 0 for not a translation, 1 is for a translation. So we've got it marked 1 here. And our subfield A's will have the language code for the languages that the material is in. So if you had, say, we had an Emily Dickinson edition that was parallel text, English language, and Swedish. So in that case, you could enter multiple subfield A's for the additional language while having the subfield H for the original language. And you may want to make a 500 note about what kind of condition you have with those languages. You know, the title of original translation, translated from, or a note about having parallel text. So your 043 is your geographic area codes. This is a 7-character code that corresponds to geographic subject headings that you have listed in order of importance, and using subfield A's to indicate additional locations. So here we've got 3 subject headings. We've got Private Detectives, South Carolina, Air Pilots, Missouri, Assassins, Scotland. So we have our 7-digit entries for each of these things. So N for North America, -US for United States, -South Carolina, or Europe, UK, Scotland. Again, this is a situation where a lot of countries don't necessarily have a final 2-digit entry here. So again, just the United States, Canada, Great Britain, Australia, and China. Most other countries, you just have 2 additional dashes here. And be careful with them because they are not always what you would expect. For example, the country code for Egypt is F for Africa -UA --. Now, why you ask UA for Egypt? Probably because a lot of these are very old and not updated frequently. So you have an entry for UA for Egypt because in the end of the 1950s, 1960s, it was technically the United Arab Republic instead of per se Egypt. And there's Library of Congress has a listing of what all of these geographical areas are. Oops. For Dewey call numbers, for folks who are using Dewey, it's your 082. 0, we have our first indicator 0 for your Dewey using the full edition of Dewey. Second indicator 4 is that this call number is being created by an institution other than the Library of Congress. And our subfield 2 at the end is which edition of Dewey is being used. Last I checked, it was 23, edition 23. I don't know if they're up to 24 yet, but it may be. All right, our author, 100 author main entry. This is your the primary entry for who created this, who created this book. So we have 100 field. Our first indicator is 1 for order, last name, name order, last name first. So we have West, comma Martin. We have a comma subfield D and his dates, and a comma and a subfield E for the relation for the relator term. So this is the author, and we can continue to add additional subfield E's for people who have multiple roles. So a lot of times with children's authors, you have the author who has both written and illustrated the book. So you could add additional subfield E for illustrator. We have a link here to a Library of Congress relator terms. This is not fixed in stone. So if you need to change it around a little bit, if you need to build some of your own, that's fine. We use for comic books, you get, and graphic novels, you often get someone who is the colorist or the letterer, separate from the person who wrote and the person who draw it. So we use subfield E colorist and subfield E letterer, for example. And there are additional subfields you can give for a title or a fuller form of a name. And we'll go over that a little bit in subject headings and 700 entries. So you also have 110 and 111 fields. 110 is a corporate author entry. Our first indicator is 1 for name and jurisdiction order, or 2 in name and direct order for organizations that are not necessarily a government agency. It's like a company or an international agency or a charitable organization. So in the first example, we have Government of South Carolina, period, subfield B, Department of Revenue. This book was created by the Department of Revenue of South Carolina. Our title main entry. So one of the notable changes from AACR2 to RDA is they used to have it's removal of a general materials designation, which was a subfield H that you still see sometimes in records that just provides a certain type of what is it? Additional descriptor of what kind of material it is. You can use customized capitalization. In our example here, we are only using the first letter and the proper nouns, and AACR2 had a thing called the rule of 3, in which you would only enter the first 3 authors that appeared on a book, followed by et al. That is no longer the case. Everyone who is an author or is listed on a title page contributing to this book should get an entry in the 245, and I'll go along that a little bit later. Our 245, our first indicator is a 1 to indicate that there is a 1XX field with this, a 0 if there is not. Our second indicator is our non-filing characters. So, this is how you tell this. This is how the MARC tells your discovery system to skip the first few characters of a title. So in this case, the H, and the space in this title. Your subfield A, again, which is in OCLC doesn't display subfield A's, so they're all implied. Others systems will. Alma, Ex Libris Alma, for example, does display subfield A's. So we have the title as it appears on the title page. Subfield B is their subtitle. You can separate additional subtitles with a semicolon. Slash subfield C, the author and contributors. We're separating multiple elements with a semicolon. So by Martin West, afterward by John Le Carre. If you have to find the title from something else, somewhere else other than a title page, you'll want to enter a 500 field with no indicators and specify where you got the title from. This may show up a lot more in, say, self-published books where someone hasn't necessarily created a title page. But again, you want to remember to inscribe the title as it appears on the title page. Let me show you a fun example of one of our items. Here we have a book from 1607, The History of Four-Footed Beasties, describing their true and lively figure of every beast, with a discourse of their several names, conditions, kinds, virtues, both natural and medicinals, and so on. This is exactly how this title appeared on the title page of this book from 1607, and I transcribed it completely, even including the in here in lively, this U is how they used to do V's in certain circumstances. Fun stuff. Varying form of title. So you can use this field to spell out numbers or words that are abbreviated to make sure that it's searchable in your catalog. Your first indicator is a 1 or a 3, depending how you want it to appear, and partially depending on how your system displays things. You may want to ask your system person how this is going to end up being displayed depending on how your system interprets it. Your second indicator, your kind of the three most common things you're going to see are blank, 4, and 8, if there's no specified type. So if you had to get your title from a cover, or if you got an alternative title from a cover or a spine, you can use 4 second indicator 4 or 8, and then describe that. You might want to describe that in a 500 note as well. Addition statement. Katie mentioned this earlier. You want to transcribe your addition statement as it appears on your title page or on your verso. Things like abridged, unabridged, or variants of these things count as addition statements. You can also, if there's an unknown, if you want to include an addition statement that does not necessarily appear on an item, you can put it in square brackets. RDA is places a lot more emphasis on how things appear on materials, whereas in ACR2 you used to abbreviate things a lot more, and it's also more inclusive in that RDA will want you to, on occasion, look outside of the text of the physical object to find what you're looking for, if you can find it. So if you can find a print, a place of publication, say on the internet, you'll want to include that on here. And as we get into publication information, I'll talk about that. So like I said, changes in RDA, always try to enter information. Don't leave things blank if you can. Our first indicators for our 264s are blank for books, and then 1 for publisher, 4 for copyright date. You also see 2 for distributors, 3 for manufacturers, and 0 for producers, although we really only use zeros for manuscript materials. Publication location. So in this case, you'll want to include a larger jurisdiction if it is present on the manifestation. For transcription, is it okay to transcribe abbreviations? For small or unfamiliar locations, you might want to supply a state or a country, or for places where there are multiple cities of that. So a good example is right here in Columbia. There's Columbia, South Carolina. There's a Columbia, Missouri, which I've also lived there. So you may want to add, a state to increase the clarity of your place of publication. And you can repeat additional places of publication with a semicolon and additional subfield A's. If you can't find a place, you can include it in square brackets. If you're really unsure, if you think you know where something's from and you're really unsure, you can include it with square brackets with a question mark. Our subfield B is our publisher, which you will want to transcribe as it appears on the title page, or enter into square brackets publisher not identified. You might get into this situation a lot more with, say, self-published materials, where there's not really necessarily a real, there's not a company behind the publication. And then in your subfield C, you're going to want to enter your date of publication or a copyright date if it lacks a proper date of publication. If you're entering copyright date, you'll want to put the publication date in square brackets and start an additional 264 field, second indicator 4, with the copyright date. Physical description has no indicators, and in your subfield A, you're going to note the number of pages or volumes in a material. The one I have up example has numbers up to Roman numeral 7, and then has up to page number 314. And we've got some additional kinds of descriptions that you might include down here. So if you have like a children's book that doesn't have any page numbers, 1 volume unpaged, 5 volumes, 1 volume various paging, or if you, and this one here is more useful for small things like kids books, children's books with a number of unnumbered pages that are relatively reasonable to count. And for large print books, you'll want to make sure to have large print in parentheses. Your subfield B is everything you put up in that the illustrations note in your fixed fields. So illustrations, maps, genealogical tables, as many as you feel are necessary to include what's in the book. You can indicate that there are color illustrations, some color. If a work is chiefly illustrations, like a comic book or an art book, for example.
David, I'm going to stop you. We have a good question about publication statement.
Okay, great.
So when there is no publisher, but it's copyrighted by the author, do you use the author as the publisher, the name of the publisher, or do you use publisher not identified?
You could use the author as the publisher. You'd want to put it in square brackets, though, just because it's not kind of an official publisher per se, but it is it is the reasonable inferral that you have made that this person is the publisher. So,
okay, thank you.
Great. And again, yeah, you're going to see that a lot with self-published materials or small print or small publisher materials sometimes. All right, your 300 continued. Subfield C, you're going to want to enter the height of your book, rounding up to the nearest centimeter. If dimensions are unusual, you can enter both height and width. So things that are perfectly square or are unusually wrong in one direction or another, unusually long in one direction or another. And you can also enter a plus sign subfield E for additional accompanying material. So if there's a computer disk, if there's a CD with it or a DVD or maps that you can take out and fold out, anything like that. And then you can make a note of this accompanying material in a 500 field. 33X, 33X fields, RDA content, media, and carrier. These are sort of the set terminology that RDA uses to describe what this object is. You don't use indicators. These are repeatable. So I've got kind of your basic setup here. So 336 for contents is text, unmediated, which means there's no device used to interpret this material. Audio-visual materials, for example, are going to have something different here. And then we have volume for a book, as opposed to, say, sheet for something that's an individual page, like a flyer or a poster. But again, these are repeatable. So for example, with comic books, we tend to use comic books and graphic novels. We use 336 text and a 336 still image to put across the point that this material is both of these things in equal importance. Okay, so series statements. Series statements can get a little weird and a little complicated. So there's the two main fields that you're using for making a series statements are a 490 and an 8XX, either an 800 or an 830, both of which you use for different things. So in these 490 options here, we have 490. A first indicator for it includes that this is a traced series, so you'll want to have an 800 field. A 0 for a not traced field. For example, Ace Publishing back in the 1960s produced a lot of do-si-dos. They were books where you have one book on one side and then you flip it over and it's a different book. So they would print two books in one, and they had a lot of, they had a numbering system in which they entered these. So this numbering system does not necessarily have to do with any series that the individual book is a part of, but rather a series, a numbered series that the publisher has assigned to it. Otherwise, in your subfield A, we have our series title. So for Brandon Sanderson's The Stormlight Archive, we have right here, and with a subfield V for which volume it is. This is how you format this volume information is at your discretion. However your institution chooses to assign volume information. So if we have that traced series and we have someone's name associated with that series, we'll want to have an 800 series personal name. In this case, these are blue because these are traced headings that the Library of Congress has established a controlled form of. So we have 800, first indicator 1 for last name first, Sanderson, Brandon, period, subfield T, and this is the series name omitting the first article, and then semicolon subfield V for your volume number, again, described to your institution's preference. When you don't necessarily have a person associated with a series, you'll use an 830 no first indicator. We have 0 for no non-filing characters, and we have our series title and our volume, just like the other ones. So this is something, for example, studies in psychology is my example. So if you had a series of books, each written by different authors, each with its own separate title, you could include the series name and volume in this 830 field paired with that 490 first indicator 1. Yeah, you see this a lot with academic publications, where you will, for example, have a university that publishes studies in psychology or studies in X or something along those lines, where each individual volume has its own title and its own author. So 500 general notes. There are a vast number of notes that you could use, 5XX fields that you could use for your records, each of which kind of does a different thing. If you want to, the 500 note is a general one that doesn't necessarily describe a specific thing, but describes information that you feel is important to get across about this item, some of which is preferred. So here we have 500 include its index. Again, back in the fixed fields, we entered index as 1, so it has an index, so we'll enter includes index. Some 500 notes you might have useful are Spanish translation of, and then the original Spanish language title, originally published as, and then if it had an a different title when it was originally published, maps in pocket, anything like that you see referring that you might think is useful. With note fields, you'll sometimes see, at least in OCLC, you'll see a subfield 5. And now this refers to an institution-specific copy of that, a specific copy at a specific institution of this item. Make sure to delete those. Our system does not automatically delete them when they come over from OCLC into Ex Libris Alma, so I have to make sure to delete them on our end. 504 is a bibliography note. So anytime a book has a bibliography, you'll want to make sure to include the phrase includes bibliographical references with page numbers in parentheses if there is a specific section that's a bibliography, or you can leave that out if the bibliography is scattered through the book. And here we have and index. So if there's bibliographical references and an index, you'll omit your 500 field includes index to incorporate it into this 504 bibliography note. 505, a formatted contents note. So this is for your table of contents. First indicator is 0. Here we have table of contents. The second indicator is blank. You're only going to use the second indicator is 0 if you're using additional subfields within the book to add greater clarity to what is in the content. So in that case, you might, if you have if you're creating a table of contents for multiple volumes, you might want to include a subfield G, and then break down what the table of contents is even further to that. You'll see this a lot used with DVD collections of TV series. So you'll have a subfield G that will list which disc, and then a subfield T with episode titles, things like that. And they just kind of set up subfield T, subfield R, just like you would do kind of a statement of responsibility in a 245 field. 520 is your summary. First indicator is blank. For summary, there are some other options. No second indicator. You'll use your subfield A to provide a summary of the book, and then a subfield C from whatever source you drew that from. This particular one is from Mo Williams' children's book that my wife's fond of. So we have the title, and then we have subfield C provided by publisher. You could also subfield C Amazon.com. A lot of times you can draw that from Amazon, or it came from the publisher, or it came from a dust jacket. I end up using this a lot with materials that we have purchased from rare books dealers. Often they'll have descriptions in their catalog about what this item is or what a collection is, in which case I'll enter a subfield C, description by seller or from seller. Another useful book note is a 586 awards note. There's no indicators. It is repeatable. You just want to enter the name of the award it's received and the year that it was given. 500 notes tend to be keyword searchable in most ILS and discovery searches. So if I go into our library catalog, I can do a keyword search that'll turn up everything that's gotten the Caldecott medal. That's at least everything that's been entered with a 586 note. All right, subject headings. I know we're kind of running out of time, and we could do whole classes on subject headings alone. So I'll be relatively brief. So the basics indicators for our subject headings: subfield X for general, subfield Y for chronological, subfield Z for geographical, and these are definitely where you're going to be including your 043 geographic area codes. Form subdivision in subfield V, so fiction, biography, juvenile literature, etc. And again, add your 043s for geographical components. Your 600s are your personal names. Here I've included some examples of different kinds of personal name fields that you might run across. So here we have 0 for forename. So when you have a person who is known by only one name, so Pope John Paul II, Queen Elizabeth, and then with subfields B and C lining out their numeration and their titles. And these are only for sort of specific titles they have. So this we don't use subfield C's for courtesy titles like doctor or things like that. Usually subfield C's are descriptors of a specific position that they hold or held, or a rank of some kind. We also have subfield Q for fuller forms of names. So if someone's known by a name with initials in it, we can use the subfield Q to spell it out. Here, J.R.R. Tolkien. Your 610, like your 110, is your corporate subject entry. So this is outlining something as an institution. So here we have 610 South Carolina. This is the subject heading is about the government of South Carolina, not South Carolina the place. Buildings and ships are also entered as 610 corporate entries, which I always thought was kind of interesting. And your 650 are your general subject headings, so just about anything that you can think of, as you can see by the list of examples that I've got out here. 651 place subject headings. So here in this 651, we have South Carolina as a place, not the government of South Carolina. And again, the United States as a place rather than as a government. If you wanted a subject heading that would describe specific sections of the federal government, you'd be doing a 610 United States, and then subfield B's listing out what department of the government you want to talk about, like this. 655, you have some subject genre headings, the different kinds of indicators. Here we have Z0 for Library of Congress, Library of Congress Children heading, and 7 for others. So, and a subfield 2 to describe them, which thesaurus you're using. So the Getty Art and Architectural Thesaurus uses the subfield 2 AAT. So if you want to add more specific notes about something that would require a broader form of terminology, you might use that. LCGFT, Library of Congress, genre form terminology is another subfield 2 that we use a lot. And this is also where you would see in other subject headings. So in your 600s and your 650s, for fast headings or Sears headings, the subfield 2 fast or Sears or what have you. Okay, your 7XX, your added authors. These behave just like 1XX fields. You're using these fields to describe the additional people that you entered that are on your title page and that are entered in your 245 subfield C. So the first person, the person who is responsible for the majority of the work, is described in your 100 field. Everyone else is described here in this 700 field. Now we've got some examples with relator terms that you can use for someone. And again, you'll see Library of Congress uses a 710 for its collection titles. So specific, and until recently, we did the same. So anything that was part of the Gary Lee Watson comic book collection, we entered under a 7. We had that heading entered as a 710 so that it was name searchable. Because of the eccentricities of Exley versus Alma, we no longer enter them in a 710. We use a kind of local field to do that. But that's really neither here nor there, I guess. And that's really it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. If does anyone have any questions about this? I know I went through this really quickly. But I'd be glad to answer any questions anyone has. If anyone wants further clarification on anything, just let us know. Both Katie and I can break things down for you and give you a heads up, or talk about how we do things locally. Because again, all of these things, ideally, they're for your patrons. They are there to help your patrons discover the item and understand if this is what they are actually looking for. If you'll always want to make some additions to correspond to how you want things locally. Okay. Yeah, so Elizabeth Doyle, in regards to 846, would you use that spelling for a title correctly since you have, as you have entered it in the 245? Yes, you certainly could enter. RDA says that we should transcribe things exactly as they appear on the title page. Wonky spellings and misspellings included. You could then use a 264 to add a correct spelling to that to make it discoverable. because your ILS, your discovery system, it's not really gonna understand automatically that that this weird spelling that's used in the title proper is going to be how you're going to search. It's not going to know that you're going to search for it in a different way, and that's what your 246 is doing. Your 246 is adding this additional way for your discovery system to search for that title. So yeah, you'll see 246 is used, especially when you have like weird titles that might not necessarily include might include something odd like a symbol or something. Any other questions or thoughts or things you're curious about? Yeah, over the next few sessions, we'll be going into a little more detail about how all these fields and things apply to different formats of materials. We'd love to see everyone in the other sessions. But yeah, otherwise, thanks for coming, and we appreciate you coming out and listening to us.
Yes, thank you everyone for being here. And definitely, if you do have any questions after today, bring them tomorrow.
Yeah. Or yeah, and Tiffany, you can send out the PowerPoints to everybody, right?
Yes, we will send out the PowerPoints. And we do have tomorrow is the AV materials, and next week we've got the non-English language materials and the 3D materials on the 8th and the 9th. So thank you both for presenting. I will go ahead and stop the recording here.